Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. As we've been talking with lawyer and paralegal bencher candidates about the upcoming election. As always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trials College, or any other education institution or organization I'm affiliated with. Today afternoon, continuing our talks, we have Horatiu joining us. So Horatiu, first of all, thanks so much there for taking the time to speak with me, and perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, thanks so much, JP. I really appreciate your time. So as you mentioned, my name is Horatio. I'm a lawyer and I'm currently running for bench, obviously. I currently work with a legal tech company in Toronto, and what we're doing is we're using AI to automate legal research. I also maintain a very small side practice, and my background is in civil and commercial litigation. I decided to run for bencher because I felt that it was very important to sort of get back to the things that really brought lawyers to the esteemed position that they have in society, and to really focus on the things that matter, basically.
Perfect. So perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit more about some of the issues and things you're most interested in this upcoming election.
Yeah, certainly. So I think one of the big things for me, it's not going to be surprising to hear, given my tech background, is that I care a lot about all of the innovation initiatives. I care hugely about the pilot project with the sandbox. I think there's both good and bad elements to that, and that's one of my big main focuses, because obviously that's one of the things I care about most, and because I think really that's how we can deliver real access to justice in this day and age. Some other things I care about, especially, are also ensuring that the fees that we're paying to the Law Society are being well used and that they're being appropriately used. The fees are very high, and we have non-practicing lawyers that are paying very significant fees too for the privilege of not practicing. I want to be very certain that the reason that they're doing that, the reason that they're paying those fees, is a very good reason. As well, I believe in supporting people who are joining the profession, especially internationally trained lawyers and candidates, because that's the background I came in through. So I understand the struggles that are faced by these candidates, and I think that we could be doing a lot more to help solve that from the perspective of the Law Society. And finally, the big thing for me as well is civility. I think that we really need to make sure that we have a law society that represents the best of what we can be, and the best of what we can produce, really.
Perfect. So let's kind of go through some of those points there. Of course, let's start with AI, given your tech background. And you mentioned the access to innovation sandbox, and you said there's some good and some bad there. Maybe you can kind of start with kind of elaborating on what are the advances there, what are the things that are good, and what are the things that there needs improvement on.
For sure, thanks so much. So, in terms of some of the great things about the AI Sandbox, for anyone who's watching who doesn't know, the LSO has basically opened up to more innovative service providers, places that will, for example, like let you do your own will online, things like that. Some of which have existed in various formats throughout the years, but some of the newer ones are a bit more customized, a bit closer to what would traditionally be regarded as legal advice. I think it's great that we're doing this. I think it's great that we're trying out new things, because there's obviously an access to justice issue. And I'm not just talking about going to court and suing somebody. The issue there is almost unfathomably large. But even just going and getting a will, for an average person, it's a very expensive endeavor. So I think that by opening it up, by trying out these new solutions, we can now take people who wouldn't have been getting any legal help for their issues before, this like 80% unserved population, and give them some legal help. Now, in terms of what isn't that great about the sandbox, Chris Bentley wrote this wonderful open letter to the LSO a while back about it, and essentially I'm just going to reiterate some of the points in that. The main one being that we have the sandbox; it's time limited. Startups take 9 years, 10 years from inception to sale or to an initial public offering. So if we have this time-limited sandbox, how are we encouraging investment in these startups? How are we ensuring that these can be viable businesses that can actually get off the ground and do things? I think that's an issue that could possibly do with being looked at, and some of the things around that.
Now, I mean, in terms of AI, and certainly I've talked to a few candidates here about some of the challenges. We've talked about like ChatGPT kind of passing bar exams and things like that. I mean, what are some of the things there from that perspective? I mean, with your tech background there and the sort of intersection between technology and law and AI, of concerns that we should have in the profession, and what are ways that we can be better making use of technology there? I mean, whether through sandbox or not, but that the law society needs to have more of a role in sorting what's good and what's bad out.
I think it's very challenging to say that it's the law society necessarily that should have a role in sorting out what's good and what's bad when it comes to AI, because it's a big challenging domain. And I mean, certainly we should have part of a say, but should it be the ultimate say? That might be challenging. You know, some of the things that are going to be huge challenges with AI are things like bias. This is something that we actually discuss at Alexi, pretty regularly. What do we do when we come across law that it hasn't been touched in 50 years, it hasn't been touched in 60, 70, 80 years. And you have these decisions that you read them and they're no longer necessarily appropriate to the way that we view things today, or to the way that we view other people today. But these are still the decisions, and in a common law system, there's still the predominating decision. So we have discussions around this. And that's one of the big challenges with AI, is ensuring that you don't have these biases that are not just being replicated, but almost in some cases even being amplified, as we've seen with some AIs. There's also the privacy element, of course. I mean, big data is big data, right? Like, you take everyone's data, you put it together, and there's always some risk there that some data bleeds through. I mean, even with ChatGPT, we saw this recently where they revealed a bunch of personally identifiable information to some people. So, those are some major risks. In terms of how we should deal with that, I think that's something that we're going to have to learn along the way, primarily, to be honest with you.
And so you just brought up there the law society should have a role, but not necessarily full domain of the issue there. So, I mean, if elected as a bencher, what would you like to see maybe the law society's kind of role in this field, if something different than that they're already doing? And where, again, could this be coming from other aspects or other areas or other organizations outside of the law society kind of oversight?
So this is probably not going to be a popular viewpoint, but I definitely think that if we're talking about AI regulation on a bigger scale, there's something to be said for greater governments actually looking at that, provincial, federal governments, because there are big implications for society as a whole. Now, in terms of where I think the Law Society could have a role, I think that there's more detailed stuff about AI. Things like, does it need to be transparent? How does it need to be explainable? These sorts of things where the Law Society could maybe, start to look at that and say, okay, well, what is the sort of level of transparency that we want for legal AI? Because if you go to ChatGPT and you type in something like, and I've done this, what's the law and participant expert witnesses in Ontario? It'll give you Westerhoff and Guy Estate and a few other relevant cases, but it'll also make up one or two cases. And if you don't have that ability to actually go in deep and to find things, it could start misleading people. So that's obviously a danger, and I think that actually might be a good place for the Law Society to say, if we're going to have public-facing products, they need to be sourceable. They need to be explainable and transparent so that people understand where the information is coming from.
Now, another point that's come up with others in this field is about the structure of legal corporations or ownership, right? In terms of, and certainly in the tech field, right, that we don't have a structure where if you wanted to have, a tech company to invest more in things like this, you can't give them, a stake of your law practice, and that sort of dissuades perhaps, more and more innovation or collaboration because there's no sort of payoff to the input, right? And even if you build up a practice and after many years of practicing, you're like, well, time to call it quits. You only have a few of the others in the field that may want your book of clients. Otherwise, it kind of dies with you. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on all that in terms of whether ownership could be expanded in terms of addressing, again, maybe encouraging more innovation, but the counterpoint may be, well, where does this open up, the legal profession in terms of different business and organizational structures?
So personally, I'm all in favor of alternative business structures, as we call them, non-lawyer ownership, all of that. I love it. I studied law in England, where this has been the case since 2008. Well, like we're going on 15 years here, and the sky hasn't fallen there. Lawyers are still practicing. They're still profitable. They're still making money. At the same time, they have fewer of the access to justice issues than we have. So, is it like a silver bullet? Is it going to solve all of our access to justice issues? No, certainly not. Are there going to be some potential problems that arise? Probably. That's the case with any new thing. But it is, I think, a helpful thing. So I would definitely be pushing for non-lawyer ownership and for alternative business structures.
Now, you also brought up fees and sort of transparency of maybe or efficiency of where the law society is spending our money, and if there can be efficiencies to perhaps look at reducing fees. Or even one of the things that I don't quite understand, and maybe someone can explain it to me one day, is why if you're not practicing, you're paying anything. I mean, let alone like 25%. I mean, I think that it roughly you're looking at $500-$600 without getting any income for that license, right? So, I mean, what thought have you given to that? And I don't know if you had an opportunity to kind of look at areas maybe where there can be efficiencies that the law society can look at in saving some money, and then hopefully passing it along to the licensees or some of the licensees at least.
Yeah, certainly. So, in terms of actually looking at areas, I haven't looked at any specific areas yet. My understanding is that we also have a bit of a transparency issue in this regard, that we don't actually see where a lot of the Law Society spending is going. So, I think it would be hard for me to say, oh, let's cut this specific thing without actually like a detailed line by line breakdown, which I certainly don't have at this point. In terms of, you know, why do people pay? I do understand the argument for the fees. I really do. Like things like the LPP, they need to be funded, and the LPP exists because there are not enough articling positions, and that's ultimately down to the profession. And we could choose to have, open up more articling positions, or choose to pay fees instead. So there's always a trade-off that's going to happen there. And that's why sometimes some people talk about the responsibility to the profession to train students and things like that, and doing it even when it might not be profitable. So I understand that. So I understand why there's the argument that we should certainly be paying the fees. But totally with non-practicing lawyers, why are they paying a fee not to practice? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I understand that we need the money for things, but I think we should be taking a closer look, and I think that starts with transparency.
Now, you brought up their internationally trained lawyers and the LPP program, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, you had gone through that route to becoming licensed. So maybe you can share kind of the importance of those other options there, and perhaps maybe your thoughts on the pathway from being educated internationally or practicing internationally, and then wanting to come and practice here in Ontario, and any barriers or hurdles or anything, I mean, essentially that can be done differently with that process to be more effective.
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with the importance of the LPP. I think that the LPP is hugely important. I had a couple of opportunities to go through an articling process, but they would have been unpaid opportunities, and I just had a philosophical opposition to that. Because from my perspective, even though I could afford it with my family situation, there were so many people that couldn't. So it wouldn't be right to perpetuate the system of unpaid articles if I could avoid it. So I did. And my way of avoiding that was going through the LPP. I also liked the fact that unlike, unpaid articles, which could have been with sole proprietors who, some of them are great, some of them are good, but not as great as the great ones. There's a variety of different sort of levels of work, of quality of work and whatnot, in terms of training. With the LPP, it was consistent. Everyone had the same training. We all know that we can come out with similar knowledge at the end, with similar skills, similar experiences. So the law firms get a uniform student out. The profession gets somebody who's had a course of learning that has been rigorously looked at by experts in the field, and that's been taught by experts in the field, because the LPP, it is taught by some of the leading litigators and lawyers in Canada. And I think that's fantastic. It's great that we can have this offer to people, that we can provide this high quality education. Compare that with articling, where you have a very variable experience. I've had friends who've, done like trials almost from day one. I've had friends who've been fetching coffee from day one. I think there's a lot to be said for repeatable experience that can produce qualified, competent lawyers all the time. Now, in terms of the pathway for practice for coming, internationally, then practicing here, the pathway was basically I studied in England. I came back. I did the NCAs and then the bar exams and the LPP. It was fairly straightforward. However, I found that the process, throughout it, there was a lot of discrimination against internationally trained lawyers. And there was a lot of doubt about why I was even doing this, why I was coming back, or whether I was, even capable of anything. I remember one particular incident. As I was sat to write the bar exam, one of the invigilators, we were just chatting to like pass the time. And they're like, "Oh, which university did you go to?" I'm like, "Oh, the University of Cambridge." They're like, "Oh, did you go there because you couldn't get into a Canadian law school?" I'm like, not joking or anything. And I'm like, man, first of all, obviously not. But secondly, imagine saying that to somebody who's sitting there nervous about to write this like insane 7-hour multiple choice exam that doesn't even fully test your capabilities or anything. And this is how you approach them. And that was an attitude that I came across time and time again with people in the profession. So I think that's something we could be doing a lot better with. You see requirements in job postings like people with a law degree from a Canadian school or a Canadian law degree or things like that. And the Human Rights Tribunal has been clear that that's not generally appropriate. But then you still see it, and you see it even in government postings. So I think the Law Society should be certainly, it should be approaching lawyers' obligations to the Human Rights Code with the gusto that the Law Society ought to approach that with.
Yeah, so I mean, with the Law Society's role in all that, and again, there was all sorts of debate at the over the last 4 years about whether articling, I mean, even longer than that for that matter, about whether articling should be paid. And on one side you have the point, well, if it has to be paid now, all these people who are offering unpaid articling, well, they're just going to say, oh, we can't afford it anymore. It doesn't necessarily address the point you brought up about consistency in the articles, right? That, again, if you're lucky to maybe get an article position, you need to get through this in order to become licensed. And you're going to say, well, hey, I'm not going to complain that I'm fetching coffee, because if I do, then the Law Society is going to say, okay, well, find another host. And I couldn't find one. It was hard enough. So what can we do, I mean, more of or better of as the Law Society? And if you're elected as a bencher, where would you sort of see discussion around these points? I mean, even if you want to look at it more generally, of improvements that could be made to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made, and specifically, as you point out, to the experience, and I'm very disappointed to hear, even as you're writing a licensing exam, those are the last words or before you start. But where can we have a better discussion or ways of improving that process for internationally trained lawyers or anyone that's seeking articling positions or getting through the licensing process?
So I think with internationally trained lawyers, where we start improving that process is with the NCAs. I think the fact that we have a very high pass rate at the NCA level and then a very low comparative pass rate at the bar exam level is indicative of an issue with the NCA. With what's happening there. So I think maybe that needs to be looked at. I think that's one of the prime things. I think if we can close that gap and we can get people who are internationally trained to be passing the bar at a similar rate, some of the perception issues in the profession will dissipate. That's one thing. In terms of how we can help people doing articling more generally, I'll be blunt, I don't know. I have my personal opinions on this. Is I like the way that the English have approached it. Where after university there's a course of either a training contract for solicitors or pupillage for barristers. They still have the split profession, and it's much more sort of you don't have to do it. Sorry, losing my train of thought there. You can do it on your own. You can essentially pay for it, much like you do with the LPP, and so that creates alternative pathways for people that weren't as fortunate to be able to get the positions that they would otherwise need. I still don't think that unpaid articles are the way to achieve it, because it doesn't, I don't see how that resolves the issue ultimately. Sure, maybe we're getting more people in, But if they're not being paid, then how much time are they spending on the practice of law? How much time are they spending on honing those skills? And how much time are they spending on actually taking care of basic survival that they now have to take care of entirely separately? It's just, it's a different experience. And I think if we want to say, let's do apprenticeships, then great, let's do these apprenticeships, let's do articling, but then let's pay it as such as well. Or, there's also the American way where we just get rid of it entirely. I can't say I necessarily agree with that, but if the issue is that we just can't provide enough positions no matter what, then maybe that is the way.
Now, Horatio, in terms of again this upcoming election, one of the biggest things there is that there are two coalitions or teams, however they want to phrase it, but that they're running, and largely, you're hearing about full stop or good governance. And again, traditionally, to my knowledge, right, if you go back to 2015 and earlier, you didn't have, maybe you had some people working together, but you didn't have these sort of formal two groups there kind of going toe to toe with each other. As an independent or unaffiliated candidate here, what are your thoughts on slates and coalitions and groups, and how have you found trying to carve out your name in this upcoming election?
Well, to be honest with you, that's kind of what made me decide to run. After the last election, I was kind of dismayed with what happened. I understood the freedom of speech points very well. My family comes from a communist country, but just sort of descended into this throwing words and names randomly afterwards for any small issue. So that convinced me to run, because I was like, this isn't acceptable. This isn't how we should be representing ourselves. I don't think slates are a good idea. I think they're an absolutely terrible idea. I understand why they exist today. I don't understand why they existed 4 years ago. I certainly don't think that the issues then warranted what happened. But it did. In terms of, to be more direct, I think the Good Governance Coalition, I don't like that they're a slate, personally. I don't like that the Law Society is beginning to have essentially political parties who are depressingly sort of semi-aligning with the mainstream political party views. I think the Law Society should be about lawyer regulation, not politics. I think the appearance of slates is not unlikely to get us the privilege of self-regulation taken away. But I will say that the Good Governance Coalition, they have said, I believe, that they want to disband the slate after they get elected. So I have a lot more faith in that than the other slate, where they have essentially spat on traditions like keeping the treasurer elected, where there's been all sorts of name calling and unpleasant things. So like I said, that's the big reason I decided to run, is because I wanted this platform to be able to talk to people about my views on these slates and on what proper regulation should look like.
And Horatio, is there anything else in terms of, I know you laid out a few points there before, I think we've largely covered, and I guess that point there may address the civility one there, but is there anything else you want to discuss or share for anyone that's listening that has a vote coming up, in terms of your stances on issues, or anything else you want to add?
I think unfortunately, this election, like last election, instead of talking about, not that this isn't a big issue, but instead of talking about all the issues, it's again coming into this focus on EDI. We have, one group that's for respect for people, and then one group that has slogans like "Stop Woke." I think it's very unfortunate. I think everyone's coming from a well-meaning place. But there's a lot of misunderstanding there about what respect for other people means. I think, one thing I would like people to know in terms of my positions is that I'm not here to say, oh, this is the only way to do things. I'm not here to say, my views from 10 years ago are the views I have today. I'm here to say, I'm here to listen. I'm open to doing things differently, and I'm open to learning, and I think that's key. I think 4 years ago what happened was we saw a rejection of learning, and that's something we should never see from lawyers. Lawyers should always be looking to learn new things and to have their eyes open to new ways of thinking and approaching things. I can't say that all of the things that I've seen have made me happy, but I've certainly learned things, and I've certainly learned things about the way that I look at things. and I've looked at that and changed my behavior accordingly. I think that it's so important that we represent the absolute best of what lawyers can be with who we elect in these elections.
Now, last couple of questions here for you. I have students that are listening, and certainly others who may be just starting off in the profession. I know you had certainly a path we were talking about to get to where you are today. Any advice, any words of wisdom for any students in particular as they look to progress through the profession?
Yeah, don't get discouraged no matter what happens. Getting to this point where I am now, I'm very happy in my role, very happy with what I do and the people I work with. But I've had challenges along the way. I've had a lot of rejections along the way. I didn't get, I didn't get into university the first time. I didn't get into my top choice for firms the first time. Like all of the rejections you can imagine, I've sort of experienced them. You can always get back up and try again. And sometimes, especially in law, where you hear terms like career limiting move, or you hear these like all or nothing statements, it can be tempting to think that a setback is a permanent setback. But that's rarely the case. And if you get up and try again, you'll find that more often than not, there's going to be people that are willing to help you through that.
Perfect. And finally here, as though there are lawyers hopefully listening that have a vote or 40 votes, 40 votes in the upcoming election, why should they use one of those votes and vote for you, Horatio?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial. I don't know that they should necessarily. I think, again, like I said, the reason I decided to run was because I wanted to have a platform on which, through which to draw attention to the issues and to what's going on. And so essentially what I want to tell people is whether you vote for me or somebody else, just look very closely at the candidates. Don't just go on slogans. Don't just go on emotions. Look closely at what people are saying and doing and vote according to that.
Perfect. So once again, thanks for taking the time for speaking with me here today. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. Wish you all the best. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.